Well, hi everyone, and welcome to another exciting edition of Adam's Music Box. And today we're celebrating the life and musical legacy of Vangelis, one of the most interesting and unique musicians to burst on the scene in the 20th century. And this was the case for many reasons. One of the reasons being the unique musical and cultural legacy of Greece. While other European cultures have traditionally clustered into various groups, there's Germanic culture and Germano-Nordic culture, which always have had some forms of connectivity and symbiosis. There's the culture of Latin Europe. There's the culture of Slavic and particularly Slavic Orthodox Europe. There's also the culture of Slavic Catholic Europe. There's the Anglo-Saxon culture of Europe, etc. And there have always been these connections between these various cultures, where Hellenic culture has always tended to stand alone, whether we're talking about music, poetry, science, architecture, spiritual traditions, and even history of politics and social development itself. And it was from this rich ancient history, but in the modern age, that Vangelis emerged as a unique musical figure in the 60s. His first band to win international acclaim was, of course, Aphrodite's Child, and this featured the vocals of the great and distinctive Demis Roussos. Albums like It's 5 o'clock, songs like I Want to Live, really just tugged at the heartstrings, but without a kind of corny sentimentality. It was a pure romanticism that combined the most progressive elements of the pop rock of the day with traditional Hellenic themes. But Aphrodite's Child reached its artistic peak, if you will, with the album 666, released in the very early 70s. Now, this was a musical interpretation of the biblical book of Revelation, and it had all the storm and fire that you would expect from something that tackled one of the more powerful, well, they're all quite powerful, but certainly a powerful book of the Bible. The music was at once experimental, at other times it was accessible, sometimes it was very soundscapey, and at other times it was very rocky. It was really such a diverse album, but united by these common themes and a whole cast of international musicians behind Aphrodite's Child, which was anchored, of course, by Vangelis and Roussos. Now, after that, Vangelis set out for a solo career, and each of his albums went progressively more into the realm of electronic synthesizers. These, of course, were the analog synthesizers of the 70s, among the most advanced in the world. And Vangelis was someone who was able to create soundscapes without the absence of solid composition. This isn't to deride soundscape composers who keep things very light and ethereal. I mean, Brian Eno would have been the first to admit that his music was about creating background music that soothed the soul, music for airports, for instance. And what's more stressful than an airport? Even though in the 70s, when that came out, they weren't even that stressful compared to how they became after a certain man took power in a certain place. But Vangelis had a different approach to instrumental synth-based music. It was ethereal. It was something very, very otherworldly and cosmic, but there was always a strong, identifiable compositional element that had beginnings, middles, ends, leitmotifs, musical themes, and even melody line. In many ways, of all of Vangelis's 70s albums, 1977's Spiral was really one of my favorites, although all of them were really interesting. Everyone has a favorite thematic album because they were in many ways all concept albums, albeit the concepts weren't always solidly defined. Many of them allowed for a kind of internal psychological definition. By the late 70s and early 80s, Vangelis took this same approach to the world of soundtracks. Now, soundtracks evolved greatly from the beginning of cinema to the 70s. From the beginning, throughout the 60s, it was really a tradition to score films with a traditional orchestra playing a combination of neo-romantic music mixed with the sort of more melodic orchestral styles of the day. By the late 60s and the 70s, artists, though, started to use music that was borrowed from either pop culture, Easy Rider, using Steppenwolf's Born to Be Wild, for instance, or in fact, music borrowed from pre existing orchestral music. Most famously, Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, which used existing music by Richard Strauss, Zarathustra, the waltzes of Johann Strauss, music by Ligeti and Khachaturian. And of course, Kubrick did something similar with A Clockwork Orange, which featured Beethoven's Ninth prominently, both the original orchestral version and a synthesizer version played by Wendy Carlos. Now, this meant that by the late 70s, a lot of filmmakers were looking for very interesting ways to approach soundtracks, whether it be rock and roll or just something different, more synth-based. And Vangelis really cornered the market, if you will, in terms of synth-driven original soundtrack material. Chariots of Fire in 1980, absolutely iconic. It's been played at the Olympics many times. Again, a kind of Greek connection there. Blade Runner was another really big soundtrack for Vangelis. El Greco, about the painter of Greek heritage, and there were so many more. Just going through the list. Conquest of Paradise, a very interesting film. And the list could go on. And he continued to, in addition to his prolific soundtrack work, he put out albums right up until the end of his life. He also was an interesting collaborator with a musician that you might not necessarily place in the corner of Vangelis, and this was Yes's John Anderson, who in the early 80s did several albums in the John and Vangelis format, which combined the unique vocal and musical writing of John Anderson with the layered and, oh, I would say, comforting, warm synth sound of Vangelis. And this was in some ways Vangelis at his most poppy, but it really worked because both John and Vangelis brought a profundity to music where they both pushed themselves somewhat away from their prog roots and towards a prog synth pop. And it really worked. And the songs, of course, very memorable, very popular around the world. Vangelis was never really a pop star. He was almost, in a way, someone like Stockhausen, who dominated the pop culture while being apart from it at the same time. Of course, Vangelis's music is much more accessible than the harsh and dissonant and atonal sounds of Stockhausen's music, but in the sense that everyone in the world of pop art, rock music, experimental music, we're all familiar with Vangelis and all familiar with Stockhausen. There are some interesting cultural similarities there, albeit they're from very different culture. Stockhausen drawing from the great Germanic philosophers, and Vangelis drawing from the great Hellenic traditions of his homeland. When he died, millions of people throughout the world, Greece especially, were very sad. But his music, I think, will live on forever because even though the instruments he adopted were very much symptoms of their age, what he did with them was timeless. When you listen to a Vangelis musical album or soundtrack, you say, well, when was this made? And unless you know the ages and kinds of the synthesizers, I don't know if someone's trying to shoot me or what, that Vangelis used, apart from that, you could say, well, they could have been written at any time and no time. And that's why Vangelis, much like the architecture of Greece, is timeless and will be there forever, even if some of it looks a bit old. Like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.